Ladies and gentlemen, yesterday afternoon, we got some bombshell news regarding the Democratic establishment's deliberate plot, led by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, to completely cover up the deteriorating mental state of former President Joe Biden. You see, just yesterday afternoon, leaked audio from a 2023 interview between former President Joe Biden and special counsel Hur confirmed beyond any doubt whatsoever that by mid 2023, Joe Biden's mental state had almost completely deteriorated, rendering him absolutely unfit to lead our nation. In truth, former President Joe Biden's 2023 interview with special counsel Hur revealed shocking memory lapses. He struggled to recall his son's death, his vice presidential years, his classified documents endangering national security with his absolute incompetence. And so, folks, before we move on with today's story, I want you all to take a listen to what special counsel Hur himself had to say about all of this. Then we're going to have a lot to talk about. Let it play.
My task was to determine whether the president retained or disclosed national defense information willfully. That means knowingly and with the intent to do something the law forbids. I could not make that determination without assessing the president's state of mind. For that reason, I had to consider the president's memory and overall mental state and how a jury likely would perceive his memory and mental state in a criminal trial. And because these issues were important to my ultimate decision, I had to include a discussion of them in my report to the Attorney General. The evidence and the president himself put his memory squarely at issue. We interviewed the president and asked him about his recorded statement, quote, "I just found all the classified stuff downstairs," end quote. He told us that he didn't remember saying that to his ghostwriter. He also said he didn't remember finding any classified material in his home after his vice presidency. And he didn't remember anything about how classified documents about Afghanistan made their way into his garage. My assessment in the report about the relevance of the president's memory was necessary and accurate and fair. Most importantly, what I wrote is what I believe the evidence shows and what I expect jurors would perceive and believe.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, that is a lot to unpackage, and we will. But before we do, I want to say real quick that if you guys enjoy the daily news updates, please consider subscribing to the channel because it really does help a ton. But now, folks, keep in mind, former President Joe Biden's catastrophic interview with special counsel Hur was almost 2 years ago, yet he remained in the White House for another 470 days or so, acting as our so-called president. That is a scandal of historic proportions orchestrated by the Democrats. The Democratic establishment, at the time led by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, ran an elaborate cover-up for years to conceal former President Joe Biden's near-total mental collapse. They lied to maintain their grip on power, betraying every single American in the country. Chuck Schumer himself falsely claimed in 2024 that former President Joe Biden's mental acuity was, quote, great, deliberately misleading voters. He wanted the Democrats to cling to power, no matter what the consequences are to our nation's safety. He even smeared anyone questioning former President Joe Biden's mental health as being far-right extremists and spreading far-right propaganda. Folks, that was not just a lie, it was a vicious attack on Americans who saw the truth and dared to speak out against the Democratic establishment. And here's the reality. Back in 2020, we on the right side of the aisle were sounding the alarm about Joe Biden's fading cognitive state during his presidential campaign against President Trump. We saw the signs, but Democrats dismissed us as being conspiracy theorists for 4 long years. They tried to gaslight the nation while Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and his progressive handlers did everything to cover up Joe Biden's mental decline. They hid the truth, choosing power over honesty, and mocked all of our concerns. Really, in my opinion, this is one of the biggest political betrayals in all of American history. Then, check this out. Former President Joe Biden's White House abused their executive privilege to block the release of his interview with special counsel Hur. They knew it would expose his complete and total mental collapse, so they deceived the American public instead. The reality is, the Democratic establishment, led by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer at the time, knowingly propped up an absolutely mentally unfit geriatric of a president. They lied to us, betrayed our nation, and endangered our national security in order to maintain their corrupt hold on power. For over 4 years, the Democrats denied former President Joe Biden's obvious decline, while progressive handlers like Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer ran the show behind closed doors. They turned the White House into a progressive puppet theater show, much to the detriment of this country. And as many of you know, throughout much of former President Joe Biden's presidency, an auto pen machine signed documents under his name. He had absolutely no clue what was being signed, handing executive authority to whoever controlled that machine, likely Chuck Schumer. And so that auto pen machine, which perfectly emulated Joe Biden's presidential signature, gave power hungry progressives like Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer completely unchecked control over our country, which really explains why they were so desperate to help cover up Joe Biden's deteriorated mental state. They were the ones running the country in his name. So, folks, here's the truth. Now that the leaked audio proves what we knew all along, we are all totally vindicated. But more importantly, we now have a rock solid case to try to impeach Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, the ringleader of this despicable cover up. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer spent years deliberately and intentionally lying to the American public about former President Joe Biden's mental clarity. For that betrayal, he absolutely must be removed from the Senate and face consequences for his betrayal of the American people. Because, folks, if lying to the American public about the president's deteriorated mental health, then usurping his executive authorities by commandeering a signature replicating auto pen machine doesn't warrant an impeachment, I don't know what does. I'm with you guys. The blatant corruption coming from all of these radically progressive Washington, D.C. swamp beasts cannot be tolerated anymore. And so, ladies and gentlemen, here's the truth. If we really want to make this country great again, then all of these corrupt, power-hungry progressives have got to be held accountable. Now, ladies and gentlemen, before we wrap up, I do want to say real quick that we officially have a Morse News Twitter page as well as a Morse News Facebook page. So if you use either of those platforms, please go down below and drop a follow in order to get breaking news updates that relate to everything we talk about here in the YouTube videos. But everyone, that is going to be a wrap for today's video, so please go down below and drop a comment. Let me know what you think about all of this. Please like the video while you're down there, and like I said earlier, please consider subscribing to the channel because it really does help a ton. Thank you all very much for tuning in today, and of course, as always, stay safe.